There are towns in this country where everything looks peaceful until you ask the wrong question or look the wrong way. Where a man can be calm, polite, and still be seen as a threat. That's where it happened. A gas station, midday. The sun was high, the heat was heavy, and one man, quiet alone, law-abiding, was pulled from his truck without warning. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. But he did have something in his pocket that would change everything. The officer slapped him in front of everyone. What he didn't realize was that the man he just assaulted wasn't a suspect. He was a federal judge, and justice was about to come for him. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Tell us in the comments. On a dry summer afternoon, the kind where the heat seemed to float above the asphalt like a ghost, nobody invited Horace Delaney drove his old forest green pickup through the narrow, sun-bleached streets of a small, affluent town that still thought it could keep time from moving forward. The truck rattled faintly as it rolled past tidy white fences and trimmed hedges, the kind of place where the mailboxes looked polished and the sidewalks were always empty after noon. He had no robe today, no courtroom to preside over, just a brief visit, planned with an old friend who lived 2 counties over, a retired minister who grew tomatoes in the back and claimed sermons were easier to write near dirt. Delaney wore khakis clean but faded, and a pale blue Oxford shirt tucked neatly at the waist sleeves, rolled halfway up, collar crisp. His posture was straight but never stiff, and he held the wheel at 10 and 2 like the driving instructor who'd trained him back in 1976, still sat in the passenger seat of his mind. The windows were down. Wind moved through the cab with the scent of cut grass and hot pavement, and the radio murmured something soft from an old jazz station, just barely holding its signal. He didn't like traveling in black SUVs with tinted windows. He didn't want drivers or escorts or flashing lights, even though protocol offered all of that. Power should never arrive like thunder, he once told a room full of first-year law students. It should knock gently, announce itself only when needed, and listen more than it speaks. That's how he lived, quietly, deliberately, with a sort of worn dignity that didn't ask for recognition but couldn't help being noticed by those who were paying attention. He pulled into the gas station at the edge of town, the one with the peeling Shell sign and the Coke machine that had been half broken since last year. Gravel crunched under the tires as he eased into a spot near Pump 3. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sound was the lazy clunk of the nozzle being placed back on its cradle by a teenage boy across the lot. Delaney stepped out of the truck's shoulders, relaxed keys swinging lightly in one hand. He moved with the calm of someone used to waiting for things to unfold. Inside the small store, the bell above the door jingled faintly as he stepped in. The cool air stung his skin for a moment, shocking and welcome. He walked slowly past the racks of chips and candy bars, pausing briefly at the coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in days. A young man behind the counter, maybe 25, pale and lanky with a jaw too tight for his own good, watched Delaney with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite suspicion either. Just that cautious, jittery glance that some folks still gave to older black men they didn't recognize in towns that liked knowing who belonged. Delaney didn't flinch. He nodded, polite the way you do when you've spent a lifetime teaching yourself how to put others at ease, even when they don't return the effort. "Afternoon," he said, simply, voice low and even. The young man didn't reply, just reached for his phone, slowly kept his eyes on the judge like a dog tracking a shadow it didn't trust. Back outside, Horace filled the tank, the pump clicking rhythmically as numbers rolled upward on the old display. The sun beat down hard now, and sweat formed along the rim of his hat. But what he felt wasn't just heat, it was something quieter, more familiar, something that moved just beneath the skin like a warning he couldn't explain. He caught sight of his reflection in the glass of the station door. The creases in his face, the silver at his temples, the steadiness in his eyes. He knew who he was, but not everyone did. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that was the beginning of everything. A soft voice cut through the silence then. "You from around here?" It was the same young man from the counter, now standing just outside the store, with one hand gripping the doorframe, the other tucked behind his back, like he was holding something out of sight. The tone was casual, but the stance wasn't. Horace paused, capped the tank, looked at the man, and said calmly, "Just passing through." The man nodded once, then disappeared back inside. Nothing more was said. but Delaney's shoulders stiffened slightly as he returned to the driver's seat. Not out of fear, he'd known far worse, but out of that old knowing that weight carried by those who understand the invisible thresholds of certain places. He took one last glance at the station mirror. No sirens, no red lights, just sun and stillness, and a silence that stretched too long. He started the engine, but didn't drive off just yet. Instead, he sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, eyes steady ahead. Somewhere in his gut he felt the air shift, not dramatically, not with a bang, but like the quiet exhale before a storm you didn't want and couldn't outrun. And though he didn't know exactly what was coming, Horace Delaney had lived long enough to recognize the sound of something breaking loose beneath the surface. And so he stayed still, breathing in slow and deep, letting the weight of the moment settle on his chest like a gavel waiting to fall. The first sign that something was shifting came not from the sky or the wind, but from the sudden whine of tires on sun-baked concrete, sharp and misplaced in the otherwise slow rhythm of that afternoon. Horace Delaney didn't look up at first. He'd heard enough engines in his life to know when one carried tension, when a man drove not to arrive, but to assert. The squad car pulled in fast, not reckless, but closed the front bumper, dipping slightly as it stopped in a wide arc, dust curling around the tires like smoke from a cigarette. The driver's door flung open before the engine even cut off, and that's when Horace knew someone was already angry before they even saw his face. Officer Ryan Mallory stepped out with the kind of posture that didn't allow space for questions. Chest puffed just slightly too far forward, chin tight, walk fast and narrow like the ground owed him clearance. He was broad, solid in the arms and shoulders, buzz-cut neat but a little uneven near the temples, the kind of man who needed the uniform to feel taller than he was. His mirrored sunglasses reflected nothing but sky and suspicion. The silence that followed his appearance wasn't natural. It was the kind of quiet that made birds pause mid-song, and strangers lower their voices at gas pumps, not knowing exactly what they were sensing, but feeling it anyway. Horace closed the door of his truck gently, the soft thunk of metal folding shut, sounding almost too calm against the hard clip of the officer's boots. He turned slowly, hands visible body language open, not from fear but from experience, the kind that teaches restraint not as surrender but as survival. Mallory walked straight toward him, no greeting, no assessment, just a flat command barked from behind his aviators. "What are you doing here?" The question wasn't curious, it was accusatory, like the crime had already happened, and Horace was just the last one to know. "I'm filling up my tank," Horace said evenly, voice calm but steady enough to carry. "Is that a problem, officer?" Mallory didn't answer right away. He scanned the area like he was expecting backup from shadows, then looked Horace up and down, pausing a second too long at the man's hands, then his chest, then his eyes. He was trying to place something that didn't fit into whatever story he'd already written in his mind. Horace could see it happening, the internal gears grinding as the uniform processed the image before him. A well-dressed older black man in a dusty pickup, alone, quiet, composed, and tried to reduce it into something he could justify confronting. "Got ID on you?" Mallory asked, voice clipped, one hand resting on the edge of his utility belt, the thumb just grazing the holster as if by coincidence. Horace didn't move right away. He held the officer's gaze for a moment longer than expected, not defiantly but deliberately, like a teacher waiting to see if a student would catch their own mistake before correcting it for them. "In my wallet," Horace said, gesturing lightly toward his back pocket. "I'm going to reach for it slowly." He spoke not out of fear but out of a habit carved from years of watching how quickly calm could be mistaken for defiance, how easily authority could be spooked by dignity. Mallory's jaw flexed once, but he gave a slight nod. Horace moved deliberately, no sudden gestures, no sighs. The wallet emerged, smooth and unhurried, edges worn from time like everything he carried. He held it out, but Mallory didn't take it right away. Instead, he stepped in closer, invading space like it was a tactic, not a reaction. "You from around here?" he asked, tone flat but probing. "No," Horace replied, his voice still, even. "Just passing through." "Where to?" "Visiting a friend. Retired pastor. Lives 2 towns east." Mallory nodded slowly, though it didn't seem like he was listening so much as waiting for a misstep that hadn't come. "Mind if I take a look in your truck?" he asked suddenly. No warrant, no pretext, just assumption swaddled in a badge. "I do mind," Horace answered, polite but firm. "Unless you have probable cause." The space between them thickened instantly, like air pulled tight around a balloon about to burst. The officer blinked once, then tilted his head just enough to make the silence feel louder. "You sure you want to go that route?" he asked, voice lower now, almost intimate in its threat. Horace didn't flinch. "I'm sure you already know the answer to that." From the corner of the lot, a woman filling her minivan paused, one hand gripping the gas nozzle, the other fumbling in her purse, maybe for her phone, maybe for keys, maybe just something to hold. Across the street, a teenager leaned forward on his bike, watching without pretending not to. The moment had grown heavy in a way that felt practiced, like a scene that had played out too many times in too many towns, only with different faces and different endings, some quieter than others. Mallory finally snatched the wallet from Horace's hand, flipping it open fast, scanning the license without reading it, looking for something to validate his mood. Horace waited still. He wasn't afraid, but he was preparing not for violence, but for the exhaustion that came when a man had to carry the weight of proving his right to simply exist without apology. The officer squinted, then looked back up, and something in his posture shifted only slightly, but enough. He didn't like what he saw, not because it threatened him, but because it challenged the narrative that had justified his behavior up to this point. And men like that, Horace knew, didn't like being wrong, especially not in public. So he braced himself, not for a punch, not for a shove, but for the next 30 seconds of decision-making that would determine whether this encounter ended in paperwork or headlines. He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take before diving under a wave. And somewhere deep in his chest, something began to ache, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing how easily things could slide, from tense to tragic, all depending on whether one man could see past what he thought he knew. For a moment, everything hovered in that fragile space where tension hasn't yet turned to violence, but the air already smells like it's coming. Horace Delaney stood still, the summer heat pressing into his back like a silent warning. And he could feel the way the officer's breath had changed, shorter, harder, faster, not from exhaustion but from a kind of internal storm gathering just beneath the surface. Officer Mallory clenched the wallet tighter than necessary, his fingers stiff against the leather, his jaw-tight eyes flickering not with uncertainty but with something more dangerous, wounded pride, and the fear of being challenged by someone else. He hadn't expected to stand tall. Horace had seen that look before, not just in courtrooms, but in locker rooms, boardrooms, and back porches, where authority had been mistaken for virtue and power for wisdom. He recognized it not as something personal, but as a pattern, one that stretched back generations, repeating itself like a fault line waiting for pressure. "You think you're clever, huh?" Mallory said, suddenly low and sharp. Not because Horace had said anything smart, but because silence from the wrong person sometimes feels like an insult to the wrong kind of man. Horace didn't respond, didn't blink, just stood there with the steady gaze of someone who knew where he was going before the other man even knew where he stood. The officer stepped closer now, just inches away, the sun glinting off his badge, his boots squeaking faintly against the pavement with each movement. "I said," Mallory repeated, louder this time. "You think you're real clever." His voice cracked at the edge, not from weakness, but from the kind of restrained fury that had no place to go but out. Horace exhaled once soft and controlled, and let the moment sit a little longer, as if giving the man time to rethink the next step before it was too late. "I think," Horace said calmly, "we both know this isn't about clever." That was all it took. The slap came fast, no warning, no build-up, just the sudden explosive sound of flesh, striking flesh, sharp and raw, echoing across the concrete like a gunshot that left no smoke. Horace's head snapped to the right, not from the force alone, but from the sheer audacity of it, his body leaning slightly as his footing shifted to absorb the hit, his left hand instinctively catching the side mirror of his truck for balance. He didn't fall, he didn't raise a fist. But he felt the burn spreading across his cheek, slow and hot like shame made visible. A gasp rose from somewhere behind him, maybe the woman at the minivan, maybe the boy on the bike, maybe someone just stepping out of the store with a half-melted popsicle. The noise seemed to pause time for a fraction of a second, like even the breeze had stopped to listen. Horace straightened slowly, one breath at a time, his spine aligning with quiet intent, and when he finally turned to face Mallory again, he didn't speak. Not at first. He simply looked at the man in front of him, not with anger or fear, but with the kind of depth that made people uncomfortable. The kind that said, "I've seen worse, but I'll remember this." Mallory's face twisted, caught between satisfaction and surprise, like he hadn't expected the slap to feel quite so public, quite so real. His chest heaved once, and his hand hovered near his belt again. Not the holster this time, but the baton. Horace saw the twitch in his fingers, the way his boots repositioned slightly, as if bracing for something more, but the moment broke not with more violence, but with words. "You just assaulted a federal judge," Horace said softly, the words delivered not as threat or accusation, but as plain truth, the kind that didn't need emphasis to carry weight. Mallory blinked. He looked down at the wallet still in his hand, then back up at Horace, his mouth parting just slightly. What he muttered. "I said," Horace repeated, his voice. "Even I am a sitting judge on the U.S. Circuit Court. You just put your hands on the wrong man." And this time it was Mallory who took a step back. Not because he believed it right away, not because he was sorry, but because a seed of doubt had been planted, and the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had seemed. From behind someone said, "Jesus Christ," in a low whisper. A man in a work uniform pulled out his phone. A teenage girl lifted hers higher. The lens was already recording red dot blinking, like a warning neither of them had read. Horace didn't raise his voice, didn't show the sting he felt radiating from his cheekbone down to his jaw. He kept both feet planted, both hands visible, both eyes locked onto Mallory's, not to challenge but to remind. "You didn't ask who I was," he said. "You didn't listen. You just assume." Mallory didn't answer. He just stood there, face turning red beneath the sunglasses, his fingers twitching like a man trying to hold onto something slipping too fast to catch. The officer's lips moved, but no words came, and the longer he stayed silent, the louder the murmurs grew around them. It wasn't just a crowd anymore, it was a reckoning forming in the heat, an invisible courtroom where phones were the witnesses, and memory was being etched into digital permanence. Horace looked once at the sky wide and indifferent, then back at the man in uniform who still hadn't moved. "I won't resist," he said quietly, "but you'll have to live with what you just did." And with that he turned slightly, letting his profile reveal the full bloom of redness spreading along his jaw, the quiet strength in his stillness now more powerful than any badge on that lot could claim. For a second, Horace Delaney felt the sting more in the air than on his skin, as if the heat itself had recoiled from what had just happened. The slap hadn't only cracked against his face, it had cracked through something invisible between them, something fragile and sacred, like the last thread of dignity a man holds when no one else is watching. But now they were watching. The quiet hum of the gas station had shifted into a low static of murmurs, and camera shutters the sound of people waking from the comfort of ignorance into the shock of witnessing something real. He didn't speak right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted the silence to do its work. Some truths didn't need to be shouted. They needed to be allowed to settle, to fill the cracks that lies had long seeped through. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his shirt, his fingers brushing the familiar edge of the badge case that had sat there for over a decade. It was old, but well kept, the leather soft from years of use, the gold seal still gleaming when it caught the right kind of light. He drew it out deliberately, not for show, not for drama, but because the time for patience had passed. The moment the badge caught the sunlight, it refracted not just metal and heat, but truth pure and undeniable. It shone like something sacred, and in that flash of gold and silence, everything changed. Mallory's eyes locked onto the emblem with confusion first, then disbelief, then something harder to name, something that looked an awful lot like panic dressed in stubbornness. "What's that supposed to be?" he muttered, but his voice had lost the spine it carried just minutes before. Horace didn't answer with words. He simply held the badge higher, arms steady, letting it speak for him. A voice from the crowd cut in sharp, sudden. "That's a judge's badge," someone said. "He's a federal judge." Another voice closer added, "Oh my God, you hit a judge. You actually hit him." The murmurs swelled like a tide pulled by fury, and phones were no longer just filming. They were broadcasting, documenting, connecting one moment of injustice to the millions that came before it, and maybe, just maybe, helping it mean something more. Mallory took a single step back, his lips parting like he wanted to speak, but no sound followed. His shoulders twitched once, a movement so small, it might have been the wind if the air hadn't been still. Horace could see it clearly now, the realization settling behind the officer's eyes, the slow descent of recognition, sinking past ego into fear. He had gone too far, and there was no retreat clean enough to erase what he'd done. "You don't look like no judge," Mallory muttered, a half-formed defense slipping out before it could be weighed by sense or shame. Horace raised an eyebrow, slow and solemn, and for the first time that day he let the pain in his cheek remind him what silence could no longer carry alone. "No," he said. "To some people I never will." The words didn't echo, but they lingered, hanging in the space between them like a verdict not yet read aloud. And in that breathless pause, the weight of what Mallory had said turned heavier than he could bear. A woman with a toddler on her hip took a step forward, her eyes narrowed with a fury earned, not learned. "What exactly is a judge supposed to look like, officer?" she asked, her voice low but piercing. Mallory didn't answer. He turned slightly, scanning the crowd, realizing too late that there were no friendly faces left, no sympathizers willing to rescue him from the hole he had dug with his own assumptions. The heat had grown thicker, the air dense with judgment, and yet Horace stood calm in the center of it all, badge still in hand, posture still tall. His face throbbed, now a deep, pulsing ache, but he refused to touch it, refused to give that wound the attention Mallory's ego craved. He had endured worse in quieter rooms and more dangerous times, but this moment was different, not because of what was done to him, but because of what it revealed to everyone watching. Mallory reached for his radio like a man clinging to protocol as if it were a lifeline. "Requesting immediate backup," he said into the mic, voice clipped and shaking. "Possible disturbance at Shell Station corner of," but he didn't finish the address. He didn't mention that he was the disturbance, that his badge now meant less than the plastic visor of the clerk, who watched from behind the glass with wide eyes and a phone in hand. Horace didn't move, didn't step forward or back. "You're afraid now," he said, not cruelly, not with pride, but with the somber clarity of someone who's seen men unravel when truth finally corners them. "Not because of what you did, but because of who I am." Mallory's nostrils flared, his hands twitching near his sides. "I didn't know," he muttered, barely audible. "I didn't know who you were." "And if I were just a man without this badge," Horace asked, "would I be on the ground right now, or in the back of your car?" The officer didn't respond. He couldn't, and even if he had, it would have been too late, because the crowd had grown larger, now drawn by the magnetic pull of injustice witnessed. Some stood silent with arms crossed. Others whispered into phones or recorded quietly, but all of them knew they had just seen something they would remember for the rest of their lives. A mechanic in oil-stained overalls stepped closer, shaking his head. "You done messed up bad, son," he said, with a gravel-thick voice that carried more judgment than any courtroom could issue. "Real bad." And Horace, still steady, still silent, watched the man who had struck him shrink by the second, not from punishment but from truth, finally being held up like a mirror too bright to ignore. He knew even before the sirens began wailing in the distance that this moment wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. And beginnings, he had learned, come with a cost. There was a silence wide and raw that settled over the gas station, lot like fog rolling in from a distant field, thick enough to taste but too still to escape. Horace Delaney stood in the center of it, the sun hot on his shoulders, the red bloom across his cheek growing deeper with every heartbeat, yet he made no move to shield himself from the eyes now fixed on him. He could feel the weight of their stares, not as judgment but as shared breath, strangers suddenly drawn into the gravity of a moment they hadn't expected to witness and couldn't walk away from unchanged. Somewhere behind him a phone dinged softly with a notification, and that small electronic sound carried louder than it should have, like an alarm. No one had the words to interpret yet. Mallory was no longer the man in control. You could see it in the way his chest rose too quickly and how he kept glancing at the badge Horace still held in the open air, like a mirror, refusing to look away. The officer's hands hovered near his belt, not decisively, but like a habit that didn't know where to go when certainty had fled. His mouth opened once, then closed, as if he were waiting for someone else to tell him what to say. But there was no script for this, no protocol to explain away the kind of mistake you make when you stop seeing people as people. The mechanic in the overalls spoke again, louder this time. "You better call your captain," he said, pointing with a greasy finger. "Or your lawyer. Or your mama. Someone." It drew a few nervous laughs from the crowd, not out of humor, but the kind of laugh people let go of when something too tense needs cracking open. The boy on the bicycle across the street had stopped filming, and was now just watching, both hands gripping his handlebars, eyes wide, expression blank. A woman whispered to her friend, "He hit a judge." Right in front of everybody. Horace didn't flinch, didn't lower his arm, didn't move to retreat or retaliate. He simply stood there, breathing slow and deep, the kind of breathing you learn in courtrooms and waiting rooms and back seats when dignity is the only thing you're allowed to carry. He watched Mallory, not with hate, not even with sadness, but with the heavy understanding that some men crumble not from being exposed, but from no longer having anywhere to hide. That understanding came from years of rulings and hearings and nights, rereading transcripts where power had been abused, and nobody had the proof until it was far too late. "Put that phone down," Mallory suddenly barked, turning sharply toward a teenager filming from the curb near the air pump station. His voice cracked harsh and brittle, and it echoed in a way that no longer sounded authoritative, just desperate. The teen didn't budge. In fact, he steadied the phone with both hands now, as if daring the officer to try something again. Horace turned slightly his profile, catching the harsh light, the edges of his badge still reflecting the sun like a blade. "You assaulted me in front of witnesses," he said, his voice low but firm, like a line drawn into the ground before a storm. "And now you're trying to intimidate them too." He wasn't accusing not in tone but in truth, and that made it land even harder. Mallory's shoulders hunched slightly, a motion most wouldn't notice unless they knew what shame looked like from the outside in. "I didn't know," he mumbled, the words spilling out uneven, soft around the edges. "You don't look like a judge." There it was, the line that stripped the moment bare, revealing every layer of assumption beneath it. The crowd stirred, not loudly, but with a shared inhalation of disbelief, like the wind shifting just before a fire catches. A woman holding a reusable grocery bag stepped closer, her lips tight. "And what does a judge look like?" she asked sharply. "You mean not black?" Her voice wasn't raised, but it struck like a slap, and this time Mallory had no words to hide behind. He turned in a small, aimless circle, glancing at the crowd, then at Horace, then at the parking lot, as if looking for a way out that no longer existed. Horace lowered his arm, not because the moment had passed, but because it had done what it needed to do. The truth had been seen, had settled, and now it began to grow roots in the eyes of everyone present. He tucked the badge back into his shirt pocket with slow precision, then crossed his arms gently, not as a challenge, but as a man reclaiming space that had never been Mallory's to invade. A pair of sirens wailed in the distance, not urgent yet, but near enough to promise that backup had heard the call. Someone from the crowd said quietly, "They're coming. Might want to be real careful now." Horace didn't respond. He just watched Mallory's fingers twitch near the radio, watched the hesitation bloom in his throat, watched the full realization settle into the man's spine like cold water seeping through layers of pride. "You done this before?" Horace finally asked, voice soft but edged with steel. "Or was I just convenient today?" Mallory didn't answer, didn't even lift his eyes. He stepped back slowly, like the ground itself had grown too hot to stand on, and for once he said nothing. And in that silence, in that thick, glaring heat of early afternoon, Horace Delaney knew that the reckoning had begun not just for one man, but for every man who'd ever stood behind a badge and forgotten what it was meant to protect. Because some truths once seen refuse to be unlearned. And some wounds once witnessed demand more than apology, they demand change. The sound of the approaching engine was low at first, a distant hum weaving through the heat waves that shimmered off the asphalt, but as it grew closer, it cut through the air with a presence that carried weight, measured, grounded, and unmistakably deliberate. A black SUV with county plates rolled into the gas station lot with no lights, no sirens, just a slow, precise authority that didn't need noise to announce itself. Horace Delaney didn't turn his head right away. He already knew who it was by the rhythm of the tires over gravel, the silence that followed the pause before the door opened. Some people announce themselves by how loud they are. Others, like Sheriff Yvette Langston, arrive with gravity so heavy it bends the air around them. She stepped out without a word, her boots landing firm on the ground, shoulders squared, chin set. Her uniform fit, like it had been sewn with purpose, the brass on her badge dulled slightly by use not neglect. Her presence was calm but alert, the kind of composure that's forged from years of carrying the weight for everyone else while making it look easy. Horace had known her for a long time, knew she came from hard country, from women who didn't cry unless the church was burning, from men who taught you to measure twice and speak once. He also knew the look in her eyes when something had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. She scanned the scene quickly, one pass over the crowd, the trembling silence, the phones in hands, the young officer who had shrunk 2 sizes in shame, and then her eyes locked on Horace. For a brief second, the steel in her gaze cracked just enough to show recognition and maybe even hurt. "Horace?" she asked quietly, but it wasn't a question. It was a checking of breath, a way to make sure the world hadn't flipped all the way upside down. He gave a slow nod, his arms still crossed his cheek, now fully bruised and beginning to swell. "Yvette," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "you're a little late." She exhaled hard through her nose, the kind of breath that comes from the gut, not the lungs. "What the hell happened here?" she said, more to the air than to anyone in particular. Then louder, directed at the man still standing beside the cruiser like a boy who'd been caught stealing from the church plate. "Mallory. Talk." But Mallory couldn't talk, or wouldn't. His lips moved, then stopped. His hands trembled just slightly. Horace saw it. Sheriff Langston saw it. And more importantly, so did everyone else. Yvette turned to her deputies, 2 of them now stepping out of another cruiser that had pulled up moments earlier, and nodded once. They knew what that meant. She didn't need to spell it out. Horace reached into his pocket and handed her the badge, the real one, not just a wallet with a seal, but the full federal identification, gold-trimmed, embedded with years of service law and decisions rendered in quiet rooms under fluorescent lights. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing his for half a second longer than necessary, like she needed to feel something human in the middle of so much breaking. She looked at the badge, then back at Mallory, who now seemed to be shrinking by the second, his posture collapsing inward, like a structure built too fast and with too much pride. "You didn't verify?" she asked him, tone colder than metal in winter. "You put your hands on a federal judge without confirming his identity." Mallory swallowed, jaw tight. "He didn't say who he was," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't have to," Yvette said. "Your job is to protect, not perform." She turned to Horace again, and this time her eyes softened just enough to let him know this wasn't about politics or damage control. It was personal, it was shameful, and it was going to be handled. "You all right?" she asked. "I'm upright," Horace replied. "That's enough for today." Sheriff Langston didn't nod, didn't offer platitudes. She looked back at her deputies, then at Mallory. "Disarm him," she said, flat and final. What Mallory blinked. "You're serious?" "You laid hands on a federal judge, Ryan," she replied, not raising her voice, not needing to. "That means your badge is no longer your shield. It's your sentence." The silence that followed was not the quiet of confusion. It was the stillness of accountability coming to collect. One of the deputies stepped forward, unbuckled Mallory's weapon with care, and handed it to the sheriff. The badge came off next, the metal cold and reluctant as Mallory passed it over his hands, trembling now in full view of everyone. Horace watched it all happen without moving, not because he felt vindicated, but because the scene didn't bring him relief. It brought confirmation of everything he'd always known, of everything that had always been denied, of everything that now stood exposed under the harsh light of a summer sun, too bright to lie beneath. The bruise on his cheek pulsed steadily, not just with pain, but with memory of other times, other officers, other bruises he'd carried without cameras or witnesses. "I'm sorry," Yvette said after a long pause. "For all of this." Horace looked at her for a moment, then spoke slowly, the words measured like a verdict. "I don't need sorry. I need change." And she nodded once, slow, heavy, like a woman who'd heard that before and knew how much weight it carried. Behind them, the crowd began to stir again, not in outrage, but in a kind of cautious hope, like they were watching a storm shift course, even if the sky hadn't cleared yet. Sirens in the distance began to fade. The tension hadn't vanished, it had only moved deeper into the soil, into the stories people would carry home that night. And as Horace turned toward the sun with one eye swollen and the other still clear, he knew the next chapter wouldn't be written by what happened next. It would be written by who refused to forget, The stillness that followed Mallory's disarmament wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes after something heavy has broken and everyone's afraid to touch the pieces. Sheriff Langston held the officer's sidearm and badge in both hands, like objects carrying more weight than metal and leather ever should, and for a long moment she didn't move. The heat still pressed down from above, thick and unmoving, but now it felt different, like the air itself had shifted allegiance, choosing truth over habit, consequence over silence. The crowd had quieted again, not because they had lost interest, but because something sacred was unfolding before them, something rare like a system correcting itself, even for just one breath. Horace stood still, not blinking, not rubbing the sore place on his cheek, not speaking into the silence because some moments required stillness to hold their shape. Sheriff Langston turned slightly and handed the weapon to her deputy without a word, her fingers brushing his glove in a motion so controlled it looked choreographed by years of carrying too much responsibility without ever letting it drop. She kept the badge in her palm a moment longer before slipping it into her pocket, almost like she didn't want anyone to see it anymore, as if it had become a kind of curse. Mallory's hands dropped to his sides, useless now, not restrained but clearly lost. His posture sagged in a way that made him look smaller than he had been just 10 minutes earlier, like he'd finally realized he wasn't the center of anything, just a symptom of something bigger, something deeper, that couldn't be silenced with commands or threatened with cuffs. "This isn't what it looks like," he said finally, voice thin and cracking, as if saying it out loud might soften the edges of what had already been seen. Horace turned to him slowly, his voice low but calm, the kind of calm that doesn't mean forgiveness. "That's the problem," he replied. "It looks exactly like what it is." Mallory didn't argue, didn't step closer, didn't ask for understanding. He just stood there, blinking against the sun, his jaw tight, his face pale now in the glare of public consequence. Behind him, the gas station clerk had stepped out from the glass doors, his apron half-tied, and a phone still in his hand, eyes wide, with the slow horror of realizing he'd lit the first match. He didn't speak, and Horace didn't look at him. There would be a time for that later. Sheriff Langston cleared her throat once, not for effect, but to move the weight in the air. "We'll be taking statements," she said, projecting her voice now across the small lot. "If you saw what happened, we'll need your account. This isn't going away quietly, and it shouldn't." People nodded slowly. A woman with sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat raised her hand. "I got it on video," she said. "I saw the whole thing." Next to her, a man in work boots added. "He didn't even ask who the judge was, just jumped straight to force." Another voice. "That kid over there's got a better angle than anyone." The kid on the bicycle nodded, face still blank but hands steady. "Already uploaded it," he said simply. "It's out there." Horace listened without interrupting, watched the way people began shifting their weight, stepping forward with their truth, as if sharing it could somehow repair what had been cracked. He didn't know if it could, he didn't expect it to, but he knew the importance of testimony not for verdicts but for memory. He'd spent his whole life gathering evidence, listening to stories, measuring truth, not by how loud it was, but by how much it cost someone to say it out loud. A deputy approached quietly, voice soft and respectful. "Judge Delaney, paramedics are on the way. You need anything until they get here." Horace shook his head once. "Number, I'm all right." But he wasn't. Not really. The pain in his face had settled into a throb, but that wasn't the ache that mattered. What lingered was deeper, a familiar weight, the old and bitter knowledge that his title hadn't shielded him from harm, only magnified the shame for the man who tried. If it hadn't been for the badge, the phone cameras, the timing, he might have ended the day in cuffs, or worse, in headlines he couldn't read. Sheriff Langston approached him again, slower, now her expression no longer hard, but lined with something more personal. "Horace," she said gently, "you want to sit somewhere? I can have someone bring a chair out." He glanced around at the growing crowd, neighbors, strangers, witnesses, some holding signs they'd pulled from their cars, as if expecting a reason to use them. Others just standing with arms crossed, waiting to see if this would be handled the way history had taught them to expect. "No," Horace said. "I'll stand. Not just yet." Langston didn't press him. She nodded once, stepped back, and began directing her team, organizing the chaos with the practiced calm of someone who had cleaned up more than her share of messes, even if this one might follow her home tonight, like the smell of smoke on a Sunday suit. The sun dipped just slightly in the sky, casting longer shadows across the parking lot, stretching everyone's outline out in front of them, like a map they hadn't chosen to draw. Horace looked down at his own shadow, saw how straight it stood, how still it remained, and in that moment he made himself a quiet promise, not to seek vengeance, not to make this about him, but to make sure that what happened today would not be allowed to disappear. Because he knew the way stories like this get buried, not in silence but in noise, not in denial but in distraction. And if he had to stand a little longer, speak a little louder, carry the weight a little farther, then so be it. He hadn't asked for this fight, but now that it had found him, he would not be the one to look away. By the time the last cruiser pulled away, and the crowd began to thin, the summer light had taken on that late afternoon softness, the kind that made everything look older and quieter than it was. Horace Delaney sat in the back of a nondescript county vehicle window, cracked slightly, letting in the scent of warm asphalt and motor oil, while a paramedic gently dabbed ointment along the ridge of his swollen cheek. The medic, a young black woman with tight braids under her cap, didn't say much, but her touch was careful, steady, and respectful in a way that didn't need explanation. "You're lucky it didn't fracture anything," she said softly, more out of obligation than necessity. Horace nodded once, though luck wasn't the word he would have chosen. Inside the station, Sheriff Langston was giving her statement to Internal Affairs, and outside reporters had already begun circling like birds, sensing a storm on the rise. They weren't shouting yet, weren't pushing microphones past the line of deputies guarding the parking lot, but their cameras were pointed, their lenses extended, and their questions were already being rehearsed in whispers, just loud enough to reach the windows. "Do we have confirmation on who he is?" one reporter asked. "Is it true he's a federal judge?" another followed. The answers were already out there, circulating online flooding feeds and building momentum faster than anyone could manage. Horace felt the hum of his phone before he heard it, a deep, pulsing vibration that repeated every few seconds, buried in the inside pocket of his jacket like a heartbeat, refusing to slow down. He didn't reach for it immediately. He knew what would be waiting: texts from colleagues, missed calls from old friends, voicemails from people he hadn't heard from in years. And beneath all of that, the noise, the endless commentary of a world that didn't just want the facts but wanted emotion, outrage, reaction. He finally pulled it out with one hand, the other still resting in his lap. The screen lit up with a scroll of notifications, articles, tweets, alerts from legal blogs, and one short message that stood out not because of who sent it, but because of what it said. "They saw it, Horace. We all saw it. You're not alone." It was unsigned, no contact photo, just a number he didn't recognize, but it hit harder than any headline could have. He stared at it for a long time, letting the words settle into his chest, not as comfort, but as acknowledgement of the weight he now carried, and the eyes that would follow him long after the cameras were gone. A knock at the window startled him gently. A plainclothes detective, tall with silver hair and dark skin, motioned for him to come inside. "We've got a room set up," the man said. "Cooler in there, and quieter." Horace nodded, stepped out of the vehicle, and followed the man through a side door that led away from the noise. The interview room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the light overhead buzzed with a slight flicker, but it was private, and that was all he needed. He sat down slowly, the weight of the day pulling at his shoulders, the echo of everything that had happened still vibrating somewhere beneath his skin. The detective offered him a cup of water and left him alone for a few minutes while they got the paperwork ready. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest but to remember. The crowd, the slap, the badge, the silence after. And then the shift, how it all turned. The second truth stepped into the light and refused to sit down again. It was a moment that would outlive the day, outlive the pain, outlive the man who'd caused it. But it would also demand something from him, something more than resilience or patience. It would demand that he speak not as a victim, not as a judge, but as a witness to something that could no longer be dismissed as rare. When the door opened again, it wasn't a detective. It was Sheriff Langston, tired but composed, holding a folder in one hand and an apology in the other. She sat across from him not as an officer, but as an old friend with too much history and not enough answers. Media's already running with it, she said. Local, regional, even national. There's no containing it now. I know, Horace said. Wasn't expecting to be a headline today. She almost smiled, but couldn't. We've suspended Mallory indefinitely. IA is opening a full investigation. The mayor wants a statement. So does the city council. Horace looked down at the cup of water in his hand, the way the light rippled through it like a slow-moving truth. I'm not here to play politics, Yvette, he said. I'm not here to help anyone manage fallout. She nodded. I told them that. He met her eyes, then the room quiet enough to feel each breath between them. I'm going to speak, he said. But not for the cameras. For the people who don't have a badge or a title or a way to make someone listen until it's too late. Outside, the first wave of protesters was beginning to gather, peaceful but purposeful, holding handmade signs, lighting candles even though the sun was still up. One read, "Dignity is not a privilege." Another simply said, "We saw you, Judge Delaney." He didn't need to see them to know they were there, because the world had already changed and now he had to decide whether to let it happen to him or walk forward and shape it himself. That night, Horace Delaney sat alone at his kitchen table, the familiar creak of wood beneath him grounding him more than the coffee cup in his hand or the low hum of the refrigerator behind him. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that didn't soothe but held your thoughts in place like pins on a board, giving them no room to drift or dissolve. Outside, the cicadas sang like they always did in late summer, their rhythm steady and stubborn, but even their voices felt smaller now, like the whole world had shifted 1 inch to the left and hadn't told them yet. His phone face down beside the coffee kept buzzing every few minutes, another message, another email, another voice wanting to be heard. The screen had lit up so many times that he could see its glow even when he closed his eyes, like it had burned into the backs of his eyelids. When he finally turned it over, the notifications were endless. Dozens of news outlets, legal advocacy groups, old law students, colleagues from circuit benches and university panels. Most were formal, professional. "We stand with you, Judge Delaney." Some more personal. "You were the one who inspired me to go to law school." And then there were others, raw and unpolished. "They saw you take that hit and still stand. That matters." One message in particular caught his attention, not because it was the most eloquent, but because it was handwritten, scanned, and attached to an email from a small town in Georgia. It was from an elderly black woman, inked in careful cursive on lined paper, her words simple but unshakable. "I've waited 82 years to see someone like you stand where we can all see you. You didn't fall. You reminded us we've been standing too." He read it 3 times before folding it gently and placing it beside his cup, letting its weight sit there like a quiet answer to every doubt that had crept into his chest since the slap. Because he had questions now, questions he'd never asked himself in all the years he'd spent in the courtroom behind the bench, wearing the robe that made people listen, not because of who he was, but because of what the robe meant. He wondered what would have happened if that badge hadn't been in his pocket. He wondered how many others had been pulled out of cars, humiliated, dismissed, and never given the chance to reveal who they truly were. He pushed his chair back slowly and moved toward the window, resting a hand against the frame as he looked out into the yard, where the porch light cast long shadows across the grass. The mailbox stood at the end of the walk, the flag lowered, but it felt like the whole world had found its way to him anyway, one message at a time. Across the street, a neighbor's lights flickered on, and for a second, Horace wondered if they knew, if they had seen the footage, if they would look at him differently in the morning. The thought didn't linger because deep down he understood that how others saw him had never really been the problem. The problem was how often he'd been asked to earn his dignity in spaces where it should have been a given, how often his silence had been mistaken for safety, his patience mistaken for peace. And now that the silence had been broken, there was no turning back. He returned to the table, sat down again, and opened his laptop, not to check the news, not to track the story, but to begin writing something of his own. Not a statement for the press, not a legal opinion for the circuit, but a letter to the students he knew would be watching him now more than ever. He pictured them, young faces lit by phone screens, some angry, some afraid, all searching for a sign that standing up was worth it. He typed slowly with the same deliberateness he used when delivering a verdict. Courage is not the absence of pain or fear. It is the choice to speak when silence would be easier to stand when the world expects you to shrink. Halfway through the letter, his phone rang, not a buzz this time, but a real call. The screen lighting up with the name of Devon Hartwell, a professor from Kansas who had once been his student, now teaching constitutional law with fire in his voice and steel in his spine. Horace answered without hesitation. Horace Devon said, his voice tight with emotion. "I saw the video. I saw all of it. You all right?" "I'm breathing," Horace said with the smallest hint of a smile. "You did more than just stand there," Devon said. "You reminded a lot of people what justice is supposed to look like." Horace let the silence fill the line for a moment before replying. "Let's make sure it doesn't stop with a headline." "No," Devon said firmly. "It won't. My students are already organizing. Letters to the commission, op-eds, you name it." "Tell them," Horace said quietly, "to stay focused, stay lawful, but never stay quiet." When the call ended, the screen dimmed again, and Horace leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the day settle into his bones. He wasn't tired in the usual sense. His body was fine, his mind still sharp, but there was a deeper fatigue, the kind that comes from knowing the story had only just begun, and that telling it right would take more than memory. It would take resolve, and maybe if enough people carried it with him, it might finally take root. The courthouse looked different that morning, though nothing had changed about its bricks, its broad marble steps, or the aged bronze seal above the entrance that had watched 1,000 cases rise and fall beneath its weight. It was the same building Horace Delaney had entered countless times, sometimes in robes, sometimes in street clothes, always with the steady gait of a man who believed in the law even when it faltered. But today, he wasn't walking in through the front entrance as a judge flanked by quiet clerks or nodding deputies. Today he came as a witness, as a man with a story etched across his skin, as someone who had once sat behind the bench and now stood in front of it, with nothing between him and the truth but memory and clarity. His steps echoed in the long hallway, the soft click of his soles across the polished tile, sounding both familiar and strangely foreign, like a language he once spoke fluently, but now heard with an accent. A bailiff held the door open for him without words, just a glance that carried recognition and something close to apology. The courtroom was already half full, not with press, not with protesters, but with quiet eyes, some filled with expectation, others with disbelief, and a few that simply watched as if waiting for a verdict long overdue. He could feel their stares without meeting them, could sense the heat of judgment mixed with respect. Mallory sat at the defendant's table, hands folded stiffly in front of him, his suit hanging loose like it had been borrowed in a rush. His face was thinner, his expression tired in a way that wasn't physical. He didn't look at Horace when he walked in, just stared down at the table like the wood itself might save him if he kept his eyes there long enough. Next to him, his attorney whispered something, nodding, too much flipping pages, as if movement might fill the silence she clearly feared. The judge presiding today was Ruth Dillard from the neighboring county, a no-nonsense woman with a voice that could quiet a room in 5 syllables and a gaze that rarely blinked. Horace had worked with her once years ago, and knew she was the kind who carried the law like a weight she respected too much to let others misuse. She nodded to him, brief and professional, then began the proceedings with a tone that brooked no performance. The prosecution moved through the facts carefully, methodically, as if placing each piece down like bricks in a road, meant to carry one truth to its unavoidable destination. There was no need for speculation. The videos had already been played 1,000 times in the court of public opinion, but today they were presented again, not for drama, but for the record. The slap, the badge, the silence that followed, the words, "You don't look like a judge." And then the crowd's reaction, the consequence, the slow unraveling of one man's certainty and the slow rising of another's quote. When it came time for Horace to testify, he rose slowly, carefully, not because of pain, but because he wanted the moment to feel real, not just for the court, but for himself. The bailiff held out the Bible, and Horace placed his hand on it, his other raised. He swore the oath not like a ritual, but like a promise to the people watching, to the ones who'd written letters, lit candles, marched in silence. He took the stand, adjusted the microphone once, then looked straight ahead, not at Mallory, not at the prosecutor, but into the air itself, as if speaking to something older than the court. "I was treated as less than human," he began, his voice low but unwavering, "not because of anything I did, but because of how I was seen before I ever opened my mouth." He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let the words stretch across the room like a quiet bridge from one side of justice to the other. "The badge in my pocket should never have been the reason this ended differently," he continued. "But it was. And that's the truth. The uncomfortable one." There were no interruptions, no objections. Even Mallory's lawyer, who had spent weeks preparing, seemed unable to find a place to interject without breaking something sacred. When her turn came, she tried to reframe the story, speaking of fear of confusion, of a mistake made under stress. "My client believed he was dealing with a potentially dangerous situation," she offered. "Objection," the prosecutor said quickly. Sustained, Judge Dillard replied, not looking up from her notes. "Stick to facts, Miss Whitby." And the facts in this case needed no embellishment. There were too many witnesses, too many angles, too many truths that had already landed. When closing arguments ended and the jury filed out, the room sat in that hollow space of waiting where time feels like it slows, not from doubt, but from the weight of what comes next. Horace didn't move. Mallory barely breathed. It didn't take long. The jury returned their foreman, rising with the practiced rhythm of someone who understood ceremony. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." There was no outburst, no cheer, no collapse, just stillness. Horace exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. When the courtroom cleared and the press began flooding the courthouse steps outside, he stayed seated for a moment longer, listening to the echo of his own footsteps in reverse, remembering every room he had passed through on his way here, and wondering what kind of ground he would have to walk next. Because justice, he knew, wasn't a gavel drop or a guilty verdict. It was what came after. When the courtroom emptied and the murmurs faded down the marble halls, Horace Delaney remained seated for a while, as if his body had not yet been given permission to rise, as if some small part of him still needed to catch up to the reality that had just been spoken out loud. The wooden bench beneath him creaked as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, not in prayer, not in exhaustion, but in quiet acknowledgement of a moment too long delayed. Outside, he could hear the soft rise of voices, reporters gathering shoes, tapping hurriedly across the tiled floors, people asking questions no verdict could fully answer. Yet in this space, where the lights buzzed low and dust drifted unnoticed in angled sunlight, Horace found a kind of stillness he hadn't felt since the moment before the slap. There had been no cheers when the verdict came, no grand reaction, just the simple finality of the words "guilty on all counts," and the dull thud of understanding hitting the room like a slow-moving wave. Mallory had not spoken. He hadn't looked at anyone. His shoulders had drooped not from defeat but from something deeper, shame perhaps, or the early cracking of a man who had built himself on assumptions and found those foundations quietly collapsing beneath his feet. He had been escorted out in handcuffs, surrounded by officers who didn't speak to him, didn't pat his back, didn't offer even the comfort of a glance. That Horace knew was not justice, but it was a necessary beginning. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his knees reminding him that time never forgets, even when people do. A courtroom clerk held the door open for him, and he gave her a polite nod, noting the way her eyes shimmered slightly, the way she looked at him, not as a judge but as something more fragile, more human. He stepped into the hallway where the temperature felt different, cooler, as if the air conditioning had just kicked in, or the building itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Outside, the sun struck hard and bright across the courthouse steps, and cameras clicked almost immediately. Microphones rose like weeds out of the crowd, each one desperate to capture a sentence that could carry headlines, feed the news cycle, stir debate. But Horace didn't rush. He walked with the same measured pace he always had, each step firm, unhurried, like a man who knew that dignity wasn't in speed but in direction. He paused near the top of the stairs and looked out at the people gathered. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving signs. They were just there, some with arms crossed, others with phones raised, and a few simply standing still, their presence speaking more than any chant ever could. He felt the quiet swell of expectation, the invisible pull of their hope pressing up against him, asking not for vengeance but for a voice. He stepped toward the nearest microphone, adjusted it gently, and cleared his throat once. "My name is Horace Delaney." He began not to remind them who he was, but to ground the moment in something real. "And what happened to me happens to far too many who don't have a title or a badge or a courtroom waiting for them." His voice was calm, deep, carrying not with force but with the weight of truth allowed to speak freely. "The only difference between me and the men and women who never get heard was that someone finally listened." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick like the air before rain, like a room holding its breath again. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He stepped back, let the silence carry his words where sound could not. And then he walked down the steps, through the parting crowd, past the cameras that still clicked and flashed, and toward the car waiting at the curb. He opened the door himself, nodded to the officer in plain clothes behind the wheel, and slipped into the passenger seat without a word. As they pulled away from the courthouse, he looked out the window and watched the reflection of the building blur into the passing trees, watched the sunlight scatter across the windshield like it had nowhere specific to go. The ache in his cheek had dulled to a tight soreness, but it no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a scar in the making, something the skin would remember even after the world tried to move on. "I thought it would feel different," he said softly, almost to himself. The driver didn't answer right away. Then, gently, "How do you mean?" "I thought justice would feel cleaner, neater." He paused, eyes still on the road. "But it just feels necessary, heavy." The officer nodded, kept his eyes on the street. "Sometimes justice is just the first shovel in the dirt, not the finish line." Horace leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes, not in sleep but in reflection. He had been many things in his life, a son, a scholar, a lawyer, a judge, but today he had simply been a man forced to prove his worth in public. And while the verdict had landed where it should, the cost of reaching that moment would live in him for far longer than the news cycle would care to remember. He opened his eyes as they turned down a tree-lined road, the branches reaching overhead like a canopy shielding them from the noise behind. He didn't know what would come next. The interviews, the backlash, the op-eds from voices who had never been there but still felt entitled to comment. But he knew this. He would face it. Not because he wanted to, but because too many couldn't. And someone had to keep standing. Weeks passed, not quickly, not slowly, but with the kind of rhythm that made it hard to tell where one day ended and the next began. The noise faded, as it always does, replaced by other headlines, newer controversies, louder outrage. Yet for Horace Delaney, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was a necessary pause, a space to breathe, to think, to feel every ache he'd been too composed to acknowledge in the moment. In the mornings he still made coffee the same way, dark, no sugar, 2 fingers of hot milk, but now he lingered over it, longer sitting on his porch as the light crawled across the lawn, listening to birds speak the language of continuity. The bruise on his cheek had turned yellow, then faded, but he could still feel it sometimes when he shaved like a ghost of what had happened, what it meant, and what had been left unsaid. The mailbox remained full, letters, cards, notes, scribbled in careful handwriting from places he'd never visited. A child from Baltimore sent a drawing of a man holding up a badge in the sun, her teacher's note attached. "We learned about justice today." A woman from Louisiana wrote, "You didn't fall. So we won't either." These weren't just gestures. They were anchors, proof that what he'd endured didn't vanish the moment the cameras turned away. That afternoon, he stood at the edge of a small stage, in a modest auditorium filled with people who had come not for spectacle but to listen. The event had been billed as a town discussion on community and accountability, hosted by the local university. But when Horace stepped up to the podium, it felt like something quieter, something sacred. He wore no robe, no title, no nameplate, just a charcoal blazer, open collar, and a face still marked by the weight of what had passed through it. He scanned the room slowly, pausing at the older man in the front row, gripping a veteran's cap, the young woman holding a notebook tight against her chest, the student with a service dog curled at his feet. Each of them carried a reason for being there, and none of them needed his credentials to know why he mattered. "I want to talk about what happens after the verdict," Horace began, his voice even shaped by years of speaking not to be heard but to be understood. Because justice doesn't end with guilt or innocence, it begins with what we do next. He paused, letting the words settle not to impress, but to make space for them to breathe. We live in a country where your name, your clothes, the car you drive, the street you're on, can change how you're treated, sometimes fatally. His eyes moved slowly across the room, catching the nods, the stillness, the visible tension in the way some people held their breath. What happened to me, he continued, wasn't special. It was visible, and that visibility gave it power. But visibility isn't justice. He stepped back from the microphone slightly, as if to remind himself he didn't need amplification to tell the truth. He shared pieces of the story, what it felt like to be pulled out of a car without cause to be struck, without warning, to be seen as a threat first and a person second. But more than that, he spoke about the days after the letters, the silence, the pressure to be composed when what he really wanted was to shout. And then finally he offered a quiet confession. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. I still do. But I also feel something else responsible. When the talk ended, there was no applause at first, just a heavy collective exhale. Then slowly a few people stood, not out of politeness, out of respect. A teenager in the back wiped her eyes. A man with a badge of his own clapped slowly, thoughtfully, like each sound carried meaning. Later, as Horace made his way toward the side exit, a young boy no older than 10 ran up to him and stopped, breathless. "Sir," he said, holding out a folded piece of paper, "I made this for you." On it was a drawing of a scale, one side higher than the other, but underneath a small sentence written in pencil. Sometimes you just need one person to make it balance again. Horace knelt slowly, took the paper with both hands, and smiled. Not wide, not performative, but true, earned. "Thank you," he said softly. "You've got more power than you know." That night back home, he sat on the porch again, the cool air wrapping around his shoulders, the stars blinking like they were keeping watch. He sipped his coffee not for energy but for rhythm, and looked out into the dark with something close to peace. He didn't believe in clean endings. He never had. But he did believe in choices, in standing when others sit, in speaking when silence becomes a lie. And maybe, just maybe, what had happened wasn't just a moment, but a movement starting quietly from one truth told fully. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not to fight back with fists, but to refuse to fall down. And when you do that, when you simply remain, you give others permission to stand too. In a world where dignity often has to be defended before it's respected, Judge Horace Delaney's story reminds us that silence is not always safety, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. It's a story about more than a slap or a badge. It's about what happens when power is abused, and when ordinary people choose to witness instead of look away. For those of us in our later years, it speaks directly to something we've long known, that real change doesn't always come from protests or politics. It begins with one person standing their ground, refusing to be erased and saying, "This isn't right." This story teaches us that courage doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like patience, like speaking calmly when everything inside you wants to rage. And most of all, it shows us that no matter how far we've come in life, we're never too old to be reminded of the power of our presence and the responsibility of our voice. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lived or something you've seen, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who still believes justice matters. Leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that speak to truth, to resilience, and to the quiet kind of power that only grows with age. Because your voice matters, and someone somewhere is still listening.